6 months after the invasion began, the HFY Dominion faced a problem they had never encountered in their long history of conquest. They were winning every battle. They were losing the war. Admiral Verthax stood in the command center of his flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing the situation across Earth. Blue symbols marked HFY positions. They controlled every major city, every important industrial zone, every significant military installation. By every measurement the Dominion used, the conquest was complete. But the red symbols told a different story. They marked human resistance activity. And every day, there were more of them. "Explain this," Verthax demanded, pointing at a cluster of red symbols in what had been France. "We destroyed the resistance cell in line last week." Commander Villeneuve reported complete elimination. 47 human fighters killed, their weapons captured, their leadership executed. His tactical officer, Selvak, pulled up the relevant data. "That is correct, Admiral." The Lion Cell was completely destroyed. However, in the following days, 3 new cells appeared in Marseille, Toulouse, and Nice. Each was founded by members who escaped before our attack. They are smaller than the original cell, but there are 3 of them now instead of 1. "This pattern repeats everywhere," added Commander Kethra grimly. "In Africa, we eliminated a warlord named Obi. His 7 lieutenants scattered across the continent. Each now leads their own faction. We killed 1 enemy and created 7. Verthax slammed his crystalline fist against the display console. "This is madness. How do they grow stronger when we defeat them?" The answer came from an unexpected source. A human prisoner, a professor of ancient history named Elena Vasquez, had been brought to the flagship for interrogation. She was thin and tired, her clothes torn, but her eyes still held defiance. When asked about the resistance, she laughed. "You want to know why you can't beat us? Let me tell you a story." She sat back in her chair, showing no fear of the crystal giants around her. Thousands of years ago, the Greeks told a tale about a monster called the Hydra. It had many heads. When a hero cut off 1 head, 2 more grew in its place. The only way to kill it was to destroy all the heads at once. She smiled at the alien admiral. "You're not fighting an army. You're fighting a Hydra. Every cell you destroy spreads its members across the land. Every leader you kill becomes a martyr who inspires 10 more leaders. Every victory you win teaches us how to fight you better. You cannot cut off our heads fast enough." Verthax ordered her returned to the prison cells, but her words haunted him. He began to research this Hydra myth and found something disturbing. Throughout human history, this pattern repeated. Empires had invaded lands and faced resistance that grew stronger with every defeat. The Romans in Germania, the Mongols in Vietnam, the British in Afghanistan, the Americans in a dozen different nations. Humans had been fighting this way for thousands of years. They had never stopped fighting this way. Meanwhile, on Earth, the Hydra doctrine spread through the resistance like wildfire. It was not an order from any commander. It was an idea that emerged naturally from 1,000 separate groups reaching the same conclusion. Never concentrate your forces. Never create a single target. When attacked, scatter and reform somewhere else. Make every defeat a seed for future victory. The corporate enclave in Singapore learned this lesson the hard way. They had been the most organized resistance on Earth, with clear leadership, sophisticated weapons, and advanced technology. The HFY noticed them. The HFY targeted them. The HFY destroyed them in a single devastating assault, turning their gleaming towers to molten glass. But before the final attack, the Singapore leaders did something unexpected. They uploaded everything they knew to every human network they could reach. Weapons designs, manufacturing techniques, intelligence on HFY weaknesses. All of it scattered across the fragmented human communications like seeds in the wind. When Singapore died, its knowledge was already growing in 100 other places. A young engineer in Brazil received the Singapore files and built a workshop in an abandoned mine. A grandmother in Finland downloaded the weapons designs and taught her village how to manufacture armor-piercing ammunition. A teenager in Kenya used the intelligence to plan an ambush that destroyed an entire HFY convoy. The HFY Strategic Command issued new orders: destroy all human communication networks, cut off the flow of information between resistance cells, isolate them and eliminate them one by one. They failed. Humans had been passing information without technology for longer than the HFY had existed as a species. Songs carried coded messages. Graffiti on walls told stories to those who knew how to read them. Patterns of stones, arrangements of flowers, the way clothes hung on a washing line. Anything could be a signal. The HFY destroyed radios and computers. Humans adapted. They always adapted. General Webb, still hiding in his mountain fortress, received visitors from 3 different continents that month. They came separately, through different routes, carrying different stories. But they all carried the same message. The Hydra was growing. We're not going to win by fighting them directly, Webb told his followers. We're going to win by being impossible to destroy. Every time they hit us, we spread further. Every time they think they've won, we come back stronger. We're not an army anymore. We're an idea, and you can't kill an idea with weapons. He was right, but he did not yet know how right he was. Because while the military resistance spread across Earth's surface, something else was growing in the shadows. Scientists, researchers, doctors, the people who had once worked in bright laboratories and clean hospitals had scattered into hiding along with everyone else. They had no equipment, no funding, no coordination, but they had knowledge. And they had begun to share it through the same hidden channels the resistance used. A biologist in Argentina noticed something strange about HFY prisoners. Their crystal bodies seemed to follow the same patterns, the same structures. They were remarkably uniform, almost identical. She wrote her observations on a scrap of paper and gave it to a messenger heading north. 2,000 miles away. A biochemist in Mexico received the paper and added his own observations about the crystal beings' reaction to certain chemicals. The paper continued its journey, collecting notes and additions from dozens of scientists who never met, never spoke, never knew each other's names. It was the beginning of something the HFY could not predict, could not understand, and would not survive. The Hydra was growing, and it was learning to bite. The stars above Earth changed on a Tuesday morning. 3,000 ships appeared beyond the moon, each one larger than any building humans had ever made. They hung in the black sky like crystals catching sunlight, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Every telescope on Earth turned toward them. Every satellite captured images. Every human heart felt the same cold fear. The message came in every language at once. The beings called themselves the HFY Dominion. Their voices were cold, like wind through broken glass. They had conquered 40 worlds before Earth. They had never lost. They gave humanity 72 hours to surrender completely. Every government, every military, every resource would belong to them. Humans would serve or humans would die. There was no third choice. The world's leaders gathered in Geneva within hours. Presidents and generals sat around a massive table, their faces pale under the bright lights. They argued about strategy. They discussed weapons that might work against the alien ships. They talked about surrender terms that might save some lives. Admiral Chun from China slammed his fist on the table and demanded immediate nuclear strikes. President Morrison from America called for calm negotiation. Prime Minister Okonkwo from Nigeria suggested hiding essential populations underground. But something strange began to happen as the hours passed. The leaders could not agree. Old hatreds rose to the surface like oil on water. Russia blamed America for weakness. China accused Europe of secret dealings. Smaller nations felt ignored and abandoned. By the end of the first day, 3 delegations had walked out. By the second day, the Geneva Council had split into 5 separate groups, each making their own plans. The HFY ambassador arrived on the 3rd day. He stood 12 feet tall, his body made of something like living crystal. Light passed through him and scattered into rainbows on the walls. His name was Verkith, and he had watched many species face their end. He looked at the arguing humans with something like amusement in his glass eyes. "You fracture," he observed to his aides. "They always fracture. Fear breaks them apart before we ever fire a weapon." But the fracturing did not stop at Geneva. It spread across the entire planet like cracks in ice. Within a week, the United Nations had dissolved. National governments began to collapse as regional leaders seized power. In America, 17 states declared independence. In Europe, old borders reappeared overnight. In Asia, corporate armies took control of major cities while rural areas fell to local warlords. The global internet split into hundreds of separate networks. Communication between regions became difficult, then nearly impossible. Banking systems crashed. Supply chains broke. People hoarded food and weapons. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly viewed each other with suspicion. Admiral Verthax commanded the HFY invasion fleet from his crystalline throne aboard the flagship. He watched the reports from Earth with growing satisfaction. His tactical officers showed him maps of human civilization tearing itself apart. Red zones spread across every continent, marking areas of conflict, collapse, and chaos. "They do our work for us," said his second-in-command, a smaller crystal being named Kethra. "We have not fired a single shot, and already they destroy themselves." Verthax nodded slowly. "This is the pattern. Every species we have conquered followed this path. When faced with overwhelming force, they abandon unity. They return to tribal instincts. They fight each other for the remaining scraps." He gestured at the blue planet below. "In another week, there will be nothing left to conquer. Only scattered tribes to collect and put to work." The HFY had a doctrine that had never failed. They called it the doctrine of decapitation. Find the leaders. Destroy the command centers. Cut the head from the body, and the body dies. It had worked on the proud warriors of Kethmer. It had worked on the hive minds of Vorath. It had worked on the machine intelligences of Systema, Prime. It would work on humans. But as Vorthax watched the chaos spread across Earth, something troubled him. A small feeling, like a crack in crystal. The other species had fractured under pressure, yes. But they had fractured slowly, reluctantly, holding on to their unity until the very end. The humans were different. They fractured almost eagerly, almost naturally, as if unity had always been a temporary state for them. He dismissed the thought. Weakness was weakness, regardless of its speed. On Earth, the old general named Marcus Webb watched the same chaos from a very different viewpoint. He sat in a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by 200 survivalists who had prepared for exactly this kind of collapse. They had food for years, weapons for decades, and a burning determination to never surrender to anyone, human or alien. Webb was 73 years old. He had fought in 3 wars for his country. He had watched politicians make the same mistakes over and over. He had stopped believing in unified government long ago. Now, watching the world fall apart around him, he felt something unexpected. Hope. "They think we're breaking," he said to his followers, gathered around a fire in the cold mountain night. "The aliens think our chaos is weakness, but they don't understand us at all." A young woman named Sarah, who had been a software engineer before the collapse, looked at him with confusion. How is this not weakness? We can't even talk to each other anymore. We have no army, no government, no plan. Webb smiled, and in the firelight, his old face looked almost young again. That's exactly right. We have no single army for them to destroy. No single government for them to capture. No single plan for them to predict. He pointed up at the stars, where the alien ships waited like patient predators. They've conquered 40 worlds. Every one of those worlds had something we don't have anymore. A center, a heart, a single place where, if you strike hard enough, everything dies. He stood up slowly, his old bones creaking. We don't have that anymore. We have no center. We have no heart. We have 10,000 hearts, scattered across every mountain and valley and city on this planet. They can't cut off our head, because we don't have one head anymore. He looked around at his people, at their scared but determined faces. We have millions of heads, and every single one of them is going to fight. Far above, Admiral Vertex gave the order to begin the invasion. His ships moved toward Earth like a storm rolling across the ocean. He expected to conquer another world within days. He did not understand what he was about to face. He did not understand that humanity's greatest weakness had just become its greatest strength. He did not understand that you cannot shatter something that has already chosen to break itself. The invasion began, and everything the Kethvari knew about conquest was about to change forever. The Kethvari landing ships descended on Earth like burning stars. Thousands of them fell through the atmosphere, their crystal hulls glowing orange from the heat. They targeted every major city, every military base, every government building that their scanners could find. This was the doctrine of decapitation in action. Strike the centers of power. Capture the leaders. Break the spine of resistance before it can form. Admiral Varthex watched from orbit as his forces landed in Geneva. The great hall where human leaders had argued just weeks ago was their primary target. Kethvari soldiers, tall crystal beings with weapons that could melt steel, marched through the empty streets. They expected guards. They expected desperate last stands. They expected frightened politicians begging for mercy. They found nothing. Geneva was empty. Not just the government buildings, but the entire city. Millions of people had vanished into the countryside, into the mountains, into underground tunnels that did not appear on any map. The only thing the Kethvari found was a message painted on the wall of the assembly hall in red letters. We are everywhere. We are nowhere. Good luck. The same scene repeated across the planet. Washington was abandoned, its White House rigged with enough explosives to destroy 3 city blocks when the first Kethvari stepped inside. Beijing had been evacuated so completely that the alien soldiers found food still warm on tables, as if the entire population had simply disappeared minutes before their arrival. Moscow burned, set on fire by its own people, rather than let it fall into alien hands. Commander Kethra reported to Admiral Vithax with confusion in his crystalline voice. There is no leadership to capture. The command centers are empty or destroyed. Our doctrine requires targets, Admiral. There are no targets. Vithax stared at the reports flowing across his display screens. Red symbols marked Kethvari positions across Earth. But between those symbols, in the vast spaces of wilderness and countryside, there was only darkness. Unknown territory. Uncontrolled space. Then we control the cities, Verthax decided. We establish garrisons. The humans will have to come to us eventually. They need food, water, medicine. They will submit or they will starve. But the humans did not come. They did not submit. They did not starve. Instead, they attacked. The first ambush happened in the mountains of Afghanistan. A Kethvari patrol of 50 soldiers moved through a narrow valley, searching for reported human activity. The rocks around them exploded. Not with advanced weapons or military technology, but with simple explosives, the kind humans had used to fight each other for centuries. Boulders crashed down. Hidden fighters appeared from caves that had sheltered resistance movements for 3,000 years. The HFY soldiers, trained to fight armies, found themselves fighting ghosts. Only 3 survived. They carried back a warning that no one believed in the Amazon rainforest. Indigenous tribes who had never been conquered by any outside force proved equally impossible for the HFY to conquer. They knew every plant, every animal, every poison that grew in their jungle home. HFY patrols went in and never came out. Their crystal bodies were found weeks later, overgrown with vines, killed by substances that alien science could not identify or cure. In the cities, the situation was even worse. The criminal organizations that had spent decades hiding from human police proved excellent at hiding from alien occupiers. They knew the sewers, the abandoned buildings, the secret passages that honeycombed every urban center. They attacked supply convoys and vanished before reinforcements arrived. They planted bombs in garrison buildings and melted into crowds that no longer existed. Verthax called a council of his commanders after 3 months of occupation. The losses were mounting. Not dramatic losses, not the kind that happened in battles. Small losses. A patrol here. A supply convoy there. A garrison commander assassinated in his sleep. 1,000 tiny wounds that never stopped bleeding. "We control nothing," admitted Commander Vexnar, who led the European occupation. "We hold buildings, but the moment we leave them, the humans return. We patrol roads, but the humans use paths we cannot find. We have the greatest army in the galaxy, and we are losing the farmers and criminals. Their chaos should make them weak," said Kethra. "They have no coordination, no unified strategy. Different groups attack us in different ways for different reasons. Some fight for territory. Some fight for religion. Some fight simply because they enjoy fighting. How is this possible?" A young tactical officer named Selvak spoke up. He had been studying human history, trying to understand their enemy. "Perhaps their chaos is not weakness," he said carefully. "Consider, we have one strategy. They have 10,000 strategies. We have one doctrine. They have none, which means they cannot violate it because it does not exist. We expect them to behave as a unified force, and they never do. Our predictions fail because there is nothing to predict." Vorthax silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Enough philosophy. We need solutions, not theories." But Selvak's words hung in the air, troubling the commanders who heard them. On Earth, the humans were learning too. Different groups, isolated by the collapse of global communication, independently discovered the same truth. The old General Webb called it the doctrine of dissolution. A resistance leader in France called it the way of water. A Chinese warlord called it the 1,000 needles. They had different names, but they all described the same strategy. Never gather. Never centralize. Never give the enemy a target they can destroy. Information began to flow through strange channels. Not through internet or radio, but through messengers on foot, through coded symbols painted on walls, through songs that carried hidden meanings. A farmer in Kansas would hear a melody whistled by a stranger and know that a HFY patrol was moving through the next valley. A fisherman in Norway would find a stone, arranged in a certain pattern, and understand that an attack was planned for midnight. The humans were not organizing. That would have created a structure the HFY could destroy. Instead, they were connecting. Thousands of separate groups, each fighting their own war, began to share knowledge without sharing leadership. They learned what weapons worked against crystal bodies. They learned what times the HFY patrols changed shifts. They learned that the aliens feared fire and darkness in enclosed spaces, and they learned something else, something that would change the course of the war. They learned that the HFY were not invincible. They could be hurt. They could be killed. They could be afraid. In his mountain hideout, General Webb received a message carried by 17 different hands across 3,000 miles. It was simple, just 4 words written on a scrap of paper. The Hydra grows stronger. He smiled and added the paper to his fire. The flames consumed it, but the message lived on, passing from faction to faction across the wounded Earth. They were not defeating the HFY. Not yet, but they were surviving. And in survival, there was hope. Far above, Admiral Verthax looked down at the planet he was supposed to have conquered months ago. For the first time in his long career, he felt something he had never experienced before. He felt doubt. 2 years into the occupation, Admiral Verthax stood alone in his observation chamber, watching Earth turn slowly below. The planet looked peaceful from this height. Blue oceans, green forests, white clouds drifting across continents. Nothing showed the war that raged on its surface. Nothing revealed the nightmare that his invasion had become. His forces controlled the skies. His ships could destroy any target they chose. His garrisons held every major city. His patrols watched every road. On paper, in every report he sent to the Dominion, the conquest was proceeding according to plan. But Verthax knew the truth. He was losing. The casualties arrived in small numbers, easy to hide in official reports. 10 soldiers lost to an ambush in the mountains. 20 killed by a bomb hidden in a marketplace. 50 dead when their transport ship was shot down by weapons that should not exist in human hands. None of these losses were significant by themselves. Together, over 2 years, they had cost him a quarter of his invasion force. And the humans showed no signs of stopping. If anything, the resistance was growing stronger. More organized, yet still without any organization, the HFY could identify and destroy. More coordinated, yet without any coordination they could intercept. It was as if the entire human species had become a single organism, acting with one purpose while remaining a billion separate individuals. The turning point came on a morning like any other. Bertharth was reviewing garrison reports when his communications officer interrupted with urgent news. Soldiers in the European sector were falling ill. Ill? Verthax did not understand the word. The HFY did not become ill. Their crystalline bodies rejected foreign substances, repelled infections, maintained perfect internal balance. Illness was something that happened to weaker species, but the reports continued to arrive, each more alarming than the last. Soldiers were collapsing at their posts. Dark fractures were appearing in their crystal bodies, spreading like cracks in ice. Those affected could not stand, could not speak, could not do anything except watch their own bodies crumble. Within a week, the plague had spread to every HFY garrison on Earth. Deep in a hidden laboratory carved into the mountains of Peru, a woman named Dr. Maria Santos watched the reports with tears streaming down her face. She was 60 years old. Before the invasion, she had been a professor of microbiology at a university that no longer existed. For 2 years, she had worked in darkness, in secret, on a project that began with a single scrap of paper passed from hand to hand across half the world. The paper had carried a simple observation. The HFY were uniform. Their crystal bodies followed the same patterns, the same structures. They had no biological diversity, no variation, no immunity to anything their bodies had not evolved to resist. Dr. Santos had never met the biologist in Argentina who wrote that observation. She had never spoken to the biochemist in Mexico who identified the chemical weaknesses in HFY physiology. She had never coordinated with the geneticist in Japan who designed the basic structure of the pathogen, or the engineer in Germany who figured out how to produce it in large quantities, or the dozens of other scientists across the planet who each contributed a piece of the puzzle. None of them had ever met. None of them had ever communicated directly. They had passed their work through the same hidden channels. The Resistance used scraps of paper, coded messages, whispered words. Each scientist solved a small part of the problem and trusted that someone, somewhere, would solve the rest. It had taken 2 years. It had involved hundreds of people who never knew the full scope of what they were creating. It was the greatest collaborative scientific achievement in human history, and it had no leader, no center. No name. It was simply called the Gift. The Gift was a pathogen designed specifically for HFY biology. It targeted the structures that made their crystal bodies function, spreading through physical contact, through air, through water. Against any other species, it would have been harmless. Against the HFY, it was death. Admiral Vothax watched his people die. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. His medical officers had no treatment, no cure, no understanding of what was killing them. The pathogen spread too fast to contain, adapted too quickly to stop. Within a month, 30% of the occupation force was dead. Within 2 months, the number had risen to 50%. He called for reinforcements from the Dominion. None came. The plague had already spread to the ships in orbit, carried by soldiers rotating between surface and space. The fleet that had been his guarantee of victory was now a floating graveyard, crewed by the dying and the dead. In his final coherent moments, before the fractures spread through his own body, Vothax recorded a message for the Dominion. His voice cracked and faded as the plague claimed him, but his words were clear. We came to conquer a divided species. We believed their chaos was weakness. We were wrong. He paused, his crystalline form shuddering. They have no center we can destroy because they need no center. They have no leadership we can capture because they need no leadership. Every human is their own commander, their own army, their own strategist. And when we threatened them all, they all responded. Not as one, but as many, each in their own way, each contributing what they could. He looked up at the observation window, at the planet that had defeated him. Their scientists created this plague in laboratories we never found, passing pieces of research through networks we never detected. No single human had the knowledge to destroy us. Together, without ever meeting, they found a way. His body began to crumble, dark fractures spreading across his crystalline form. Recommend immediate withdrawal. Quarantine the fleet. Quarantine the sector. Do not send more forces. This species cannot be conquered. They have turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. His final words were barely a whisper. We came to shatter Earth, but they were already shattered. And that saved them. The broken cannot be broken. The scattered cannot be scattered. We never had a chance. The message ended. The flagship fell silent. Below, on Earth, the humans watched the alien ships begin to drift. Their crews dead or dying. Their threat finally ended. In her mountain laboratory, Dr. Santos wept. Not from joy, though victory was sweet. She wept for the 2 years of fear and hiding. She wept for the colleagues she had lost, the world that had been destroyed, the future that remained uncertain. She wept because she knew that the war was over, but the work of rebuilding had only begun. Above her, the stars were clear for the first time in 2 years. The crystal ships still hung in orbit, but they were tombs now, not threats. The HFY Dominion, which had conquered 40 worlds, had met its end on the 41st. They had been defeated not by strength, but by chaos. Not by unity, but by division. Not by any single weapon, but by a million small acts of resistance that together formed something unstoppable. The humans had won. And they had won by being exactly what they had always been. Broken, scattered, divided, unconquerable. 20 years had passed since the last HFY ship fell silent in Earth's orbit. The crystal vessels still hung there, monuments to a failed invasion, slowly being dismantled for materials by human salvage crews. Children born after the war had never known a unified Earth. To them, the old stories of nations and governments sounded like fairy tales, distant and strange. The world had changed. The old nations never reformed. The old governments never returned. Why would they? The chaos that had saved humanity had become humanity's new way of life. Thousands of independent city-states dotted the continents. Corporate territories managed the production of technology and medicine. Tribal confederations controlled vast stretches of wilderness. Nomadic fleets sailed the oceans, answering to no authority but their own. They called it the distributed era, and for the first time in human history, there was no empire, no superpower, no single force that dominated all others. General Marcus Webb died 8 years after the war ended. He was 91 years old, and he passed peacefully in his mountain home, surrounded by followers who had become family. His final words, passed from person to person across the scattered human settlements, became something like a prayer. Stay broken. Stay scattered. Stay free. Dr. Maria Santos lived longer. She spent her remaining years teaching in a small settlement in Peru, training the next generation of scientists in the collaborative methods that had saved humanity. She never took credit for the gift. She insisted, truthfully, that she had only contributed a small part. The real creator was humanity itself, working together without ever meeting, trusting each other without ever speaking. But the greatest change was not on Earth. It was among the stars. Human ships began to leave Earth 15 years after the war. Not a unified fleet, not an organized colonization effort, but a scattered migration of independent vessels. Some were built by corporate territories seeking new resources. Some were constructed by religious groups seeking sacred isolation. Some were simply adventurers, individuals and families who looked at the stars and decided to see what lay beyond. The galaxy watched with growing unease. The HFY dominion had collapsed. The plague that humanity created had mutated, adapted, spread through the ships that fled Earth and carried the infection home. 40 conquered worlds were suddenly free as their crystal masters crumbled. The dominion, which had lasted 10,000 years, fell in less than a decade. Other species who had lived in fear of the HFY now looked at humanity with a different kind of fear. They sent observers to watch these strange beings who had defeated the unconquerable. They tried to understand how a species so divided, so chaotic, so constantly at war with itself, could possibly pose a threat. An ambassador from the Velinary Collective visited Earth 30 years after the invasion. She was a fluid being, her body constantly shifting between forms, her species known for their diplomatic wisdom. She asked to speak with humanity's leaders. The human who greeted her laughed gently. "We have no leaders," she explained. "Not in the way you mean. I speak for my city. The woman in the next valley speaks for hers. The captain of that ship speaks for his crew. You can negotiate with any of us, but none of us can bind the others." The ambassador was horrified. But how do you make decisions? How do you prevent war? How do you coordinate action across your species? The human woman shrugged. "We don't prevent war. We fight sometimes, between ourselves. We always have. But we also trade and talk and share ideas. Information flows between us like water. When something threatens us all, we respond, not as one, but as many. It's messy. It's inefficient. It works." The ambassador returned to her people with a warning. Do not threaten humanity. Do not give them a common enemy. Let them fight among themselves. Let them squabble over resources and territories. Let them be chaotic and divided. Because when they unite, they do not truly unite. They become something worse, something that cannot be fought with conventional weapons or strategies, A HFY survivor was found on a dying colony, shipped 50 years after the war. He was one of the last of his kind, his crystalline body scarred by the plague, his mind haunted by memories of defeat. A journalist from the Velinary Collective interviewed him, seeking to understand the fall of the greatest empire the galaxy had known. "How did they defeat you?" The journalist asked. "Your forces were overwhelming. Your technology was superior. How did a primitive species destroy the Dominion?" The HFY was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of extinction. "We came to shatter them," he said slowly. "That was our doctrine. Break the enemy's unity, and they fall. Every species we conquered followed this pattern. Unity was their strength, and unity was their weakness. When we broke it, they were helpless." He looked at the journalist with eyes that had seen the death of his civilization. But the humans were already shattered. They had no unity to break. They had spent their entire history fighting each other, dividing themselves, forming and dissolving alliances. What we saw as chaos, they saw as normal. What we thought would destroy them only made them more dangerous. What advice would you give to other species who encounter humanity? The HFY let out a sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no joy. Do not try to understand them as one thing. They are not one thing. They are many things, contradictory things, beautiful and terrible things. They fight each other as fiercely as they fight outsiders. They build and destroy with equal enthusiasm. They are chaos given form. He turned away, his fractured body catching the dim light of the ship. And chaos, we learned too late, cannot be conquered. It can only be survived. The journalist asked one final question. "Do you hate them for what they did to your people?" The HFY was silent for a very long time. "Hate them? No, I fear them. I respect them. I mourn what we could have been if we had understood them." He paused. "But I do not hate them. They did what any species would do when faced with extinction. They survived. They adapted. They won." His crystalline eyes dimmed. "And in the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To survive. To pass our inheritance to those who come after. The humans have done this. Their inheritance is chaos and division, and an unbreakable will to endure." He looked out at the stars, where human ships move freely through space that had once belonged to his empire. "It is a good inheritance," he said quietly. "Better than ours." The interview ended. The HFY died a few years later, the last of his kind. But his words lived on, passed from species to species throughout the galaxy. A warning and a lesson for all who might encounter the strange, divided, unconquerable beings from the third planet of an ordinary yellow star. They had been shattered. They had been scattered. They had been broken in 1,000 ways, and that had saved them Dodd in the end. It was not their strength that preserved humanity. It was their weakness, their inability to stay united, their stubborn insistence on going their own way, making their own choices, fighting their own battles. The galaxy learned to live with humanity the way one learns to live with a storm. You could not control it. You could not predict it. You could only watch it pass and hope it left you standing. And somewhere, in a small settlement in the mountains of what had once been called Peru, children sang songs about the old days, about the crystal monsters who came from the stars, about the broken people who refused to break further. They sang about chaos. They sang about survival. They sang about an inheritance worth keeping. They sang about being human.